And then I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint, which is different one from the one I've been working on all last week, but I noticed that I'd had some revisions in my computer. And so I kind of did a change about. Um, we're going to spend about 22 sessions. I have 26 of these PowerPoints. And so I may do 1.5 or 2 some of these sessions. And the other thing, the other component that I'm going to add is reading materials every single week. I'm going to throw out some books, some original sources, some summaries of time periods, as well as theological controversies, different ways of looking at things. And especially in the case of Reagan and Caleb, this won't apply to other men that may join the calls. But for the two of you, when you look at these book sections, and if there's one of these books that you want to read, go ahead and just kind of make a mental note, because there are going to be some issues that come up in this class where you're going to want to know more about it. And I'm afraid that in just 22 sessions of covering 20 centuries of church history, that I'm summarizing vast amounts of information. I don't have time to really dig into the nth degree as much as I would like. And I can point you to some original sources. In some cases, I'll assign a video for you to watch. In other cases, I'll say this is a book that you're going to read definitely. But I'll throw out a whole bunch of books, and if there's one that pertains to something that you'd really like to find out more about, go ahead and take a mental note of that, or if not a written note. And I think Reagan will probably end up reading more of these than Caleb, simply because he has a year head start. And there are a lot of books that Reagan read last year I'd like to assign to Caleb. But so Reagan might get twice as many of these books as Caleb does, but I don't think even Reagan will want to read church history every single week. So, but we'll just see how that goes. A lot of these lessons will be fairly simple and contain, again, some general information, much of which you already know, some of which you don't know, but it will give you a better perspective in looking at the big picture. And then if you really want to do a deep dive, then read one of the books. And I'll talk about each book a little bit and some of the benefit that I got out of those books, and maybe that will translate into something that will help you. One more little detail, and that is I'm inclined to bump this hour up to either 12 or 12:30 starting next week. Do either of you uh, have an issue with that, or problem? It gives us a little bit longer afternoon to get some other things done, but it also might cut into lunchtime. Any perspectives on that?
I'm good with whatever. I'll adjust to whatever works best for lunch.
Okay.
I fit my schedule around this class, so whenever it works.
Okay. Maybe we could do 12:30. Shoot for 12:30 and 12:30 to 1:30, and then uh, it won't cut into half the afternoon. So I think I'll throw that out in an email to the other guys that might participate. Okay, so this is just an introduction, and let me get right to it. Why history? Hegel said the only thing that we learn from history is that we never learn from history. And I think there's a tremendous amount of truth to that, is that there is considerable historical amnesia in the world today, particularly among young folks who think that anything over 10 or 15 years is ancient history and has no relevance whatsoever to the current situation, and that technology completely changes the equation. The social political climate is so different than what came before us that we can't respect anybody beyond 15, 20 years ago because they were all prejudiced and didn't think like we think. And there's a lot of that historical prejudice against those who've gone before us, which is a huge mistake because historical cycles tend to repeat themselves or at least rhyme. Mark Twain said, "I never let my schooling interfere with my education." And George Santayana, the Harvard historian, "Those who cannot remember the past are destined to repeat it." And there are a lot of admonitions to regard history and those who've come before us, even in the New Testament and in the Old as well. Remember your leaders who spoke to you the word of God, considering the result of their conduct, imitate their faith. I think that the Hebrew writer is alluding to people like Peter, Paul, James, stellar Christians, apostles that were no longer with them. And you can learn from remembering what happened before your time. So the value of looking at history and scripture side by side, we can learn from the successes and the mistakes of others. We better understand the progression of God's plan from the fullness of time till the end of time, and why things developed the way they did, what detours certain trends tended to take, what doctrinal controversies erupted, why we face the situation we face today in light of what happened in the past. We see heroes and villains grappling with timeless principles and the consequences, both good and bad. I believe that toward the end of the second quarter here, when we look at restoration history, we'll look at a lot of mistakes. We will not idolize churches of Christ in the general direction the mainstream churches are going just because they call themselves churches of Christ and have come out of the restoration movement. There have been huge mistakes, and we'll look at some of those mistakes, huge controversies. And one definite thing that grows out of that is you cannot put your faith in people. You have to put your faith in the Word of God and continue to study it, continue to revitalize by looking at those principles afresh, just like they did. We reserve the same rights that those who've gone before us have. We can learn from them. There's certainly, and we can hone our thinking, sharpen our skills. But nonetheless, we have to open the book afresh with a mindset of discovery, just like those who've gone before us. And go back to the blueprint. Although I was very eager to write to you, beloved, about our common salvation, Jude says, I found it necessary to write appealing to you to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints, one time for all time, so done as to be of perpetual validity. And the term translated once or once for all, it was used in sales transactions in the ancient world of a done deal, that it is finalized. And the idea of delivering and receiving become technical terms. In the New Testament, I developed that in my Inspiration to Ink series. And so this idea of delivered to the saints means that there was a repository of New Covenant materials written down in the Gospels, in the epistles of Paul, in Acts, in the general epistles, that forms a faith once for all delivered to the saints, and one time for all time. Therefore, whatever was delivered during that precedent-setting age period becomes the normative pattern for all time and the common property of all Christians from that time going forward. And therefore, a total historical amnesia about that or anything in between that period and now is a huge mistake, because there has been so much that has transpired since then, and we have to go back to that beginning precedent as our pattern for everything, and therefore we have to learn from those who've gone before us. I love it when we can actually look at pictures of ancient Christians, and there are actually several out there. This is rare, but um, there are funerary inscriptions from ancient Egypt, some of which were Christians, some not, but people look like people. I know that's a huge revelation, but in some cases they look surprisingly modern. And those funerary descriptions from Egypt are, I've got a couple of books on that actually, with lots and lots of portraits that date all the way back to the first century. One of the things that you discover right from the get-go, and I think in the book that Reagan has read this last week, that Christianity defined a people by the book. And from the very get-go, uh, Christians were interested in canon. They were interested in the New Covenant. They were interested in the Old Covenant and the New Covenant read in church, as well as read privately if they could get their hands on a copy. And this was New Covenant driven, it was book driven. And therefore, even though many Christians in the New Testament period could not read, it's a novel concept, and most modern Christians can't even relate to that, but probably the vast majority of New Testament Christians could not personally read. And their way of internalizing New Testament truth was through a lector or a reader reading scripture in church. That was a common practice in the Roman Empire. It was done for entertainment in venues in the Roman Empire in which famous books were read, classical books, plays, and so on. And people would come together for a reading. It was done in the synagogues. It was done in churches. And but because of the nature of the new covenant and how important it was from the very outset, you have literacy rates rising among Christians. You have Christians copying the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And eventually you have a great interest among Christians centuries later in copying books of late antiquity. And a lot of the books of antiquity that have been preserved in the Middle Ages, many of them, if not most, were written or preserved by Christian scribes who had an interest in book learning and book preservation. And so Christians were known as a people of the book from the very get-go, and even in the second century on. And again, I think this probably is represented in the book that Reagan just read, that the Codex became a favorite book form. I'll talk about that a little bit later, versus the scroll. And this is one of the few instances in history in which Christians were ahead of the technological curve in book technology, but they had an acute interest in reading and in the codices that formed the books that would be read in church, the books that were recognized as part of their canon. And so they even preserved books of late antiquity, as I suggested, including the illustrations. One of the books I've read a year or two ago that talks about some magnificent medieval manuscripts suggests that even the illustrations of books from late antiquity before the Roman Empire collapsed, that even those books, I think that was 476 if my memory serves, that those books were preserved, even the illustrations carried forward into some of these medieval copies. You have early Christian artifacts, mostly in the form of manuscripts, but you do have some art that begins popping up second century and beyond, some of which may date all the way back to the late first century, but the catacombs are full of this kind of thing. You have Christian graveyards in which you have these kinds of symbols, and ichthus is the Greek word for fish that forms an alphabetic acrostic, Jesus Christos Theouios Soter, which is Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. And this was from a gravestone in Cologne, Germany, not far from where Andrea grew up. And you have the Chi Rho symbol. That's the cross is from, it's like an X or a key in the Greek, which is CH, and the P looking thing is actually an R in the Greek. Chi Rho meaning Christos or Christ. And then you have the Alpha and the Omega. It's all circled. And you've got a couple of birds that sometimes dovetailed with the whole resurrection concept. And so a lot of that you see early Christians. There are 3 or 4 major significant turning point events in the last half of the 1st century, and I'm just going to allude to them now. I'm not going to develop them in any great degree, but in AD 64, Rome burned, and there was an outbreak of persecution under Nero of Christians following that burning of Rome. We'll talk more about it a little bit later. Couple of weeks down the road, I'll allude to it again. But on July 18th, 64, fire broke out in the merchant area of Rome, and it was fanned by summer winds, continued for 6 days, 7 nights. 70% of Rome was destroyed in those fires. And the people blamed Nero, who was pretty crazy. And he needed a scapegoat, and the scapegoat became Christians. Peter and Paul were among the martyrs. And I will, a couple of weeks down, I'll cite some more details on that. But you have a graffiti in the Palatine Hill Museum in Rome. This dates all the way back possibly to the 1st century, but it's a crucified donkey, and you have a worshiper of a crucified donkey. So the graffito here is poking fun at Christianity, and it says Alexamenus worships his God. And so crucifixion was not something that was glorified. It was shameful. And I developed that in my sermon this next Sunday when I talk about 1 Corinthians 1, and I'll use this graffiti here. The other thing that happened the same decade, in 80, 70, and 66 to 70 was the Jewish War, and the Arch of Titus in Rome shows the looting of Jerusalem and the carrying of the candlestick, the candelabra, and looting of the temple and so on. But that was a devastating event. If you've never read Josephus's description of that, I highly recommend it. It's gory, it's brutal, and when I read it some years ago, I basically said to myself, I had no idea. I've heard about the destruction of Jerusalem. We study it a little bit in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, but I had no idea how brutal it was until I read Josephus's description. And so I highly recommend that. But what happens as a consequence of that AD 70 destruction is you have a split between Jews and Christians that is intensified. It was already on display in the Acts of the Apostles when the Jews go after Paul, and you have problems there. But after AD 70, and there's no temple, then Judaism and Christianity go their separate ways even more than they already had. And what you'll find in the latter part of the 1st century is the accentuating of the differences. The Rabbi Johanan ben Zakkai escaped Jerusalem in a coffin, started a rabbinical school 30 miles away in Jamnia. Study of the Torah replaced the ritual of the temple. And about 85, a formal anathema was added to the synagogue liturgy. And that anathema was, may the Nazarenes and the heretics be suddenly destroyed and removed from the book of life. Prior to that time, there were a number of Jewish Christians that would still attend synagogue and try to influence their Jewish neighbors. But toward the end of the first century, then there is such a rift that you'll even see vestiges of that rift in the book of Revelation. Slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. And there's a lot of history behind that. But as you get into the second century, you have Justin Martyr in dialogue with Trypho, is a Jew. You've got a lot of statements among second century Christians about Jews that are engaged in helping the Romans to persecute the Christians. And they become real enemies after that destruction of Jerusalem. So the other big thing happens almost a decade after that is the eruption of Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum. And what in essence it does is it captures two cities frozen in time from the first century, so that you could visit Italy and feel like you're visiting the first century, and actually see shops and homes and walk in, and there were wall art and a number of things that I'm not going to show here, but if you have a book on Pompeii and Herculaneum, and I have some that you can look at if you want, but some of the images are, to put it mildly, X-rated, and it gives a kind of a background to some of the things you read in Romans 1, and we think that the farther back in history you go, the more puritanical things were. That's absolutely not the case. We have nothing on them in terms of immorality. That's not to say that things are not bad now in a lot of ways, but they had their own immorality, and it was alive and well in the first century. You do have one thing that was found in a house preserved by this volcanic rock, and archaeologists are not sure what to make it. I think this comes from Herculaneum, if my memory serves correctly, but there are some who think this is a cross, and may well be. I'm not sure. They're not sure, but it is interesting that that would be preserved on a wall in AD 79, which is quite early. And I wouldn't think personally that Christians did a lot with cross art yet at that point, but not sure what to make about that. So I'm going to recommend some books. I'll talk about each of them a little bit. And if you want to read a book that covers all of church history, if you want a general one that isn't too cumbersome, that has lots of neat pictures, charts, graphs, then Erdman's Handbook of the History of Christianity is really good. Covers all the major movements. It doesn't cover the Restoration movement very well, if at all, but at least you have a kind of a bird's eye view of all of church history, and it's an easy read. If you want something that goes into more detail, even though it's an older book, it's still valuable. Kenneth Scott Latourette, A History of Christianity. Last year, Talon, Reagan, and I all read Dominion, which is Tom Holland's book, How the Christian Revolution Changed the World. And it's not really a book on church history in some ways, but in other ways it is. It's kind of a book on church history in disguise. And the main theme that runs throughout the book is how the cross of Christ has influenced Western civilization. But over and over again, as he weaves through each major century and each major period of time, it primarily is a book about church history and the different ways in which Christians contradicted themselves or went this direction and then swung the pendulum back the other direction and back and forth, and how that in turn was influencing the larger Western civilization. And to such an extent that we can't even get out of that influence, is what he's suggesting. And he is not a nominal Christian. He grew up with the religious faith, rejected it, but he's a great storyteller, and he sympathizes with his theme enough that you would not know that he's not a faithful Christian if he doesn't tell you in the beginning of the book, or at least a professing Christian. The Triumph of Christianity, Rodney Stark, he was a sociologist at Baylor University in Texas. And this is a phenomenal book because he asks brand new questions. Why did Christianity grow? And how did the role of women in the church impact that? How did the role of plagues and pestilence impact that? And how Christians reacted to it? How did the way Christians dealt with the slavery issue, how did that impact that? And the racial issues? And he looks at it from a completely different angle and gathers all the data that one could possibly gather, some of which is lacking, but he does the best he can, and then looks at how scholarship has synthesized some of those things. And his conclusions are extremely interesting. I'll just say that I really would like both of you to read that book. It's a really interesting book. You're going to learn things you didn't know, but it's extremely fascinating read about why, in some ways, why paganism lost and Christianity won. And he continues in this particular book even beyond the first few centuries into later eras. But if you want to stick with early Christianity, you could do worse than these 5 books. If you're interested in how early Christians did evangelism, Michael Green, not to be confused with our own Michael Green of Santa Clara, wrote a book, Evangelism in the Early Church. It's worth reading. It not only takes evangelism models of the first century, but it extends it into the first few centuries. He talks a lot about the second century and what Christians were doing to evangelize their neighbors, and some of the public evangelism models versus the private evangelism models. How did they reach the world? And fascinating book, I think. The Earliest Christian Artifacts, Larry Hurtado. The book that Reagan just read was also by Larry Hurtado. This one focuses on early Christian book technology, reading practices, the differences between books on scrolls, books on codices, and how we know whether a copy of an Old Testament book was written by a Christian scribe or a Jewish scribe. There are 2 distinct differences. One is Christians had a way of summarizing divine names with nomina sacra, with a line slashed over the abbreviation of the names of God, Christ, Spirit, cross, and some other things. And Jews would simply give significance to Yahweh. And even in the Greek manuscripts, initially write out Yahweh and then eventually Lord, Kurios, the Greek word for Lord. And Christians would summarize that. Instead of Kurios, it might be KS in Greek with a little slash over it. And that was one of the two differences. And the other big difference is the Old Testament books in Jewish circles were on scrolls. The Old Testament books in Christian circles were on codices. As far back as you can go, pretty much. Almost all the New Testament manuscripts are on codices instead of scrolls. And Larry Hurtado explores some of those things. Backgrounds of early Christianity. This is kind of Everett Ferguson was a friend of Paul Earnhardt in ACU. They went to ACU together, and he ended up being a professor at ACU himself. And he became, for a while, probably the world's leading authority on second century Christianity. And so this is a book on first century Christianity, the cultural and historical background, the tendencies. You also have F.F. Bruce on the right side, New Testament history, good book. First 4 or 5 centuries of Christianity, how they played out. W.H.C. Friend, The Rise of Christianity, good summary of that period. And if you want to read original sources, you could do a whole lot worse than these 3. Josephus, Jewish historian that says quite a bit about what's going on in first century Palestine. The Apostolic Fathers, second century Christians, and those who still overlap to some degree with the oldest apostles that lived toward the latter part of the first century. And a lot of these guys were born late first century, and some of them would have overlapped with the Apostle John, for example. And you get to read what second century Christians would have said in that collection. Eusebius, 4th century church historian, and he preserves a lot of documented materials from earlier than the 4th century. And if we didn't have Eusebius, we would be lost about a lot of what happened in the first 4 centuries, because he preserves it. He's not a perfect historian, and he also tends to read some of the developing Catholicism back onto earlier centuries to a degree. We can talk about that later, but he talks about what happens to the apostles, which we'll look at next week. He develops, the bridge between first century Christianity and second century Christianity. He talks about the great persecutions in the first 4 centuries of the church, the great doctrinal controversies, the heretics, the heroes, and you have a lot of those developments that play out. And without Eusebius, again, we would be in a world of hurt trying to reconstruct a lot of that, but he gives at least a skeletal structure to it. And it's not a difficult read. If you read it, you'll think, as I have thought, that he's reading some 4th century ideas back onto the first few centuries, which I think he is. But things by then had changed incrementally enough that little changes eventually become big changes when added to other little changes. And by the time Eusebius comes around, you've had some significant changes in Christianity. But nonetheless, he is a valuable witness in preserving sources of things that happen, in some case, firsthand sources of earlier Christians that otherwise we would not have access to. And then last but not least, Everett Ferguson's Early Christians Speak. It's kind of a summary of some of those there's a couple of volumes he's got on this now. This was the first one, and then he's added some things to it. Encyclopedia of Early Christianity is first 3 or 4 centuries, all the major doctrinal controversies, all the major players, and it's an encyclopedia of A to Z. And so you want to learn more about, and Everett Ferguson, who edited this, Everett Ferguson did all these books, but he edited that. He doesn't do all the contributions. Obviously, he had a team of international scholars that collaborated with him. But he wrote the entries on baptism, the church, some of the things that we're concerned about, elder, things like that, that would be of special significance to us. He contributed those little things. And Baptism in the Early Church was an invaluable book to help me in my debate a few years ago. And it's the best book on baptism outside the New Testament that preserves, what went on in baptism in the early church. And he starts in the 1st century, starts with the New Testament documents themselves, goes to the 2nd century. And ironically, the 2nd century statements on baptism are still, for the most part, extremely sound. The pendulum did not swing yet. And most of what the 2nd century Christians say about baptism is right on target. There are little minor incremental changes that you begin to detect, but the main purposes for baptism and how they did it was identical to what we see in the New Testament. And he really develops that. It's a good discussion, but it's a very thick book. It's not something for casual reading. But if you're really studying something, or if you're in a debate like I was, it's an invaluable resource. Got one more. Okay. Destroyer of the Gods is what Reagan just read, I think. And then early Christian distinctiveness in the Roman world. And the Christians, as the Romans saw them, would be 2nd century pagan views of Christians and Christianity. What did the pagans think of the Christians? It's kind of an interesting book. And Robert Wilkins' discussions of that. Okay. Would you be interested in any of these books? Yeah. They're all good. They're all worth looking at. Mustard seed growth, 1st century. If we didn't have Acts of the Apostles, it would be like not having Eusebius in the 4th century for the first 3 centuries of the church. If we didn't have Acts of the Apostles, we would largely be ignorant of many of the major developments of 1st century church history. But as some have pointed out, Acts is primarily the westward flow of the gospel, and Luke doesn't tell us a lot about the eastward flow. We are largely in the dark, even in reading Acts, about the gospel going toward Persia and the east. And it does go that direction. We know it did. But we are largely in the blank as far as some of the early developments are concerned. But Luke does take us from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, through Western Asia into Europe, and finally ends up in Rome in Acts 28. We don't know exactly how the church in Rome began, but sometime after the scattering of the early disciples, you have Christians that have gone into Rome. And we know from early sources that there were churches in all these different places. You can hypothetically argue that Paul's statement in Colossians 1 that the gospel had reached the entire world would put the orbit beyond this, or you could argue that Paul's view of the world matches the known world of the Roman Empire. But at least in terms of what can be documented, fairly firmly and accurately, we know that by the time you get to the early 2nd century, the gospel has gone to at least all of these places. And I'm not going to develop this. You can read Michael Green's book on early evangelism if you want. But the Acts of the Apostles does speak in a couple of spots about publicly and privately, publicly and from house to house, Acts 5, 41, 42, and also Acts 20, 20 and 27. And you have little insights into some of the venues that were used, whether synagogue, school of Tyrannus, or other venues that were utilized. But his book develops that more fully. You have one thing that I definitely would point out if I were teaching this to a general audience of Christians is the simplicity of New Testament Christianity. Simple local churches, simple structure, simple organization, simple worship, simple work, no institutional bureaucracy. And the glue that bound them together was loyalty to Jesus and the new covenant, period. And that apostolic Christianity fostered that idea, that they were bound together by an apostolic blueprint and not by other considerations that take root later on in church history of a hierarchy and power politics. But if we go back to in a time machine to the 1st century, I think we would recognize some things, and I think we would also be stunned by the simplicity of it all, of Christians likely meeting in somebody's home with simple prayers, reading of scripture, breaking of bread, singing of praise, contribution for evangelism or benevolence, mutual encouragement. We would recognize a lot of things, I think, that went on, but we would also be stunned because of the privacy of the homes that were used oftentimes during that period. So I've got some thought questions. You don't have to consider these, but the radical nature of early Christianity and the pattern theology that comes from the New Covenant, I think, are a couple of keynotes from this general period. And what we're going to do next week is, again, look at the direction that the apostles go after they're scattered themselves from Jerusalem. We'll look at the close of the 1st century and some of the bridges that take us into the beginning of the 2nd century. Probably look at 1st Clement, Ignatius, and a couple of the apostolic fathers. I'll recommend some more books that deal with that period. And I think I'm going to call it today. Any other questions or comments? I think if you want to do a deep dive on any of these things, I've thrown out enough books that that should interest you, at least 1 or 2 of them, that you would say, I definitely would like to read that one. And I hope that, just let me know toward the end of this week as you get a jump on next week. If you'd like to read one of those, let me know which one or ones. And I've got copies of most of these. A few of them I've only got in electronic form, but most of these I've got hard copies for. Okay. I hope that right off the bat you can see this has potential value, and as we get beyond the 1st century into the centuries beyond that and look at some of the incremental changes going on, look at some of the controversies being fought, that that will give you at least kind of a reference point for how things developed and why they developed the way they did, and what were some of the major tendencies that were occurring, and what they did right, what they did wrong, how it continues to impact us today. Okay. All right. If there's nothing else, we'll call it a day. And you all have a good afternoon and have some good Bible studies tonight.
All right. Well, thank you.
Take care.